Welcome to the 1960s video on civil rights. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and make sure to like, comment, and share these videos with your friends. Thanks so much. Many important people in the civil rights movement of the 60s. One was Rosa Parks, who helped to start the Montgomery bus boycott. She started the whole modern civil rights movement when she refused to give up her seat to a white person on a ride home from work in Montgomery, Alabama. African Americans chose not to ride the bus in protest, and this lasted for over a year. The bus lines lost revenue, and it really showed that people could really vote and make decisions with their money. Another person was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had a famous I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. at the March for Jobs and Freedom, where African Americans called for civil and economic equality. This is probably one of his most famous speeches ever. Stokely Carmichael was a third person. He was the leader of the Black Panther movement, who eventually started the Pan-African movement as well, which was calling for the liberation and unification of Africa. He's also commonly associated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which soon after he took over started to become a bit more violent because they saw that the nonviolent methods weren't really working. A fourth person was Malcolm X. He was a converted Muslim civil rights activist who was a huge proponent of Black power, so that meant violence was sometimes necessary. Whatever African Americans needed to do to make sure the whites listened to them. He was sort of like the antithesis to Martin Luther King Jr. because sometimes he thought that violence might be necessary to counteract this white violence. These leaders formed many organizations and movements during this time. One was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which was founded by James Farmer, and he was an activist who founded this organization in 1942 committed to nonviolent civil disobedience. So one thing that they advocated for was sit-ins at certain segregated lunch counters across the South. Another one was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. It was founded in 1957 by Dr. King and others who wanted to achieve civil rights through promoting Christianity. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was founded in the 60s, and it was founded by students and young activists for civil rights. These people had less to lose, so for them, this new ideal of civil rights was really worth it, even if they got kicked out of school or whatever. And a fourth was the Black Power movement. This sort of advocated for racial pride and values of African Americans to achieve rights and goals. Sometimes, though, they were violent. Many events helped to shape the civil rights movement. One of them was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. It was an iconic landmark decision where the court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was passed in the late 1800s, and overturned other cases. It mandated that equality in schools and other public places should be the new law of the land. What was significant about this was that they used psychology, how some African Americans felt that whites were superior, and the bad laws of Jim Crow to show that the segregation was really taking a toll on American morals. So that's how they won that case. Another case was Greensboro Sit-Ins. This was organized by CORE, where many African Americans sat at a whites-only counter in North Carolina at a Woolworth's department store. They were refused service, but they showed that civil disobedience worked. Many weren't arrested, and eventually the whole lunch counter was integrated. Another one was the significant letter from a Birmingham jail written by MLK in his jail time during protests. So he was protesting in Montgomery and other places in Alabama, and he called for disobedience of unjust laws with nonviolent resistance, while police met him with violence and eventually he was jailed. There's also a march to Montgomery and Selma. This was also led primarily by MLK and other leaders. It protested for the enfranchisement or voting rights in Alabama for African Americans, getting rid of poll taxes and other discriminatory measures like grandfather clauses. A final one was the Watts riots. It was when a motorist, an African American one, was arrested by whites police officers in the Watts neighborhood. This led to many riots all across the nation, but especially in Los Angeles in 1965. Much legislation that was passed during this era from both sides, both people who didn't want segregation and those who wanted it. One was the Southern Manifesto. It was a document signed by 101 members of Congress from the Deep South states in 1956, and it argued that Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka contradicted the Constitution, and they voted in favor of keeping segregation in place. Only a few did not sign, including a Senator of Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson, who would eventually become president. And when he became president, he signed a lot of important legislation to protect American citizens. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in public accommodations and employment on the basis of race, sex, skin color, religion, or national origin. This is where we have this image of equality really come into the American mind. He also helped to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This overturned tactics used by states to deny voters the right to vote, such as the grandfather clause, poll taxes, and other literacy tests that were still going on at this time. These were the two most significant pieces of civil rights legislation since the end of Reconstruction. A final one that applied to more broad international appeals was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. It abolished a national origins quota system since the 1920s, and it gave a preference system to focus on immigrants' skills, not their race, and family relationships, this chain migration. If you already had relatives here, you could probably come here as well. And this dealt with citizens or residents of the United States, and it significantly changed how new immigrants came into the United States in the years that followed, even till today.